All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's Next Century Cities webinar, Back to Basics. And thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kat Blake, and I'm the Policy and Program Manager at Next Century Cities. So just a few quick notes before we get started. We are asking everyone to remain on mute so that we can reduce the impact of background noise. So if everyone could just check their audio now, and if you're not on mute, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, that would be very helpful. Next, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared on our resource page later today should you want to refer back to it or share it with any colleagues. And lastly, I wanted to mention that our goal for this webinar in particular is to make it as interactive and audience-driven as possible. We really want to make sure we're talking about what you want to learn about and answering your questions. So on the screen here, you'll see a list of topics that we've outlined to go over today. And as we go over these, we really encourage you to submit your questions, comments, and suggestions at any time via the chat box in the bottom right hand of your screen. You can send them to everyone or just to the organizers, and we'll be sure to address them throughout the presentation. You'll see at the end of the agenda that we've left a portion of time for audience questions, but please don't feel like you have to save your questions for that period. Again, feel free to submit them at any time. So our speakers for today, this is an all Next Century Cities webinar team. So we'll be hearing from our Executive Director, Deb Sosha, as well as our Policy Director, Christopher Mitchell. So with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Deb and Chris.
Great. Deb, I don't know if you have any words of introduction, but this is going to be a very informal podcast. And so let me just see if Deb, is there anything you want to say to set this up? If you are saying anything, it is occurring on a muted line.
Of course it is. Just going to mention that we are going to work really hard to keep the jargon down, and when we use terms, we're going to try to define them. But I'd also like to note that at the end, we've got a whole bunch of links that you will be able to connect to that will help you learn more, and that includes a glossary of terms. And so at the end of the webinar, Kat will be sending you the slides so you'll be able to figure it out, right? So if you've got a question, you'll have a way to get to those slides.
Great. First one? Yes, and I want to note this is something where, if you have some burning questions, I strongly encourage you to throw them in the chat. That's going to be the most effective way. If you are having trouble with the chat, you could always email Kat Blake. Kat, do you want to just briefly let people know what your email address is if they don't have it handy?
Yes, definitely. So my email is C for Kat, and then Blake, B-L-A-K-E. So cblake@nextcenturycities.org. And I'm also the one that sent you the webinar reminder. If you have that handy in your inbox, feel free to just reply to that email.
So if you're having problems with the chat or you just want to email them, Kat will get your question in. We did come up with a broad agenda, but it will work better if you have specific questions so we make sure that people know what's going on. Deb and I are going to kind of tag team this. I think I've been tasked with maybe doing a little bit more of the driving, and I'm happy to do that. And I think we could go very deep on any one of these, so I will tend to just gloss over and dig deeper if anyone has any specific questions or just says, tell me more about X. One of the things I thought we'd start with for people who are somewhat new to this, there's a number of different city officials who may not have a background in this, and that's when we talk about broadband, there are different technologies that commonly deliver it. Most of us started probably with dial-up services back in the 90s, and broadband was originally basically anything that was faster than that. And the first thing that came out was effectively DSL, which is short for digital subscriber line, but frankly that doesn't tell you anything you didn't know before. So the point is that DSL is a technology that allows you to transfer faster information over a copper line. So you don't need new infrastructure to a house or a business. You just use this technology to to deliver speeds over existing copper lines that telephone service is already to the premise. Then there's cable load shortly thereafter, which uses the coaxial cable network. Both of those, in some ways, we think of now as legacy technologies. The cable networks tended to be faster. Cable networks are very fast today in most areas, although quite asymmetrical, which means that you can download much faster than you can upload. And in fact, the uploading is quite limited. That's true of DSL. It's true of cable. Some fiber optic networks, fiber optics being the most advanced technology today to transfer information, are run in a manner that's asymmetrical, but these do not have to. So there's a number of different topics there, but those are the general, I think, some of the key things to understand about those wired technologies. Deb, is there anything that you want to fill in? Deb, I think you might still be on mute.
And I was just saying that I wish everybody would take a moment and make sure their line was muted, and I said that while mine was muted. The one thing I would mention is that not all of these are broadband, right? The broadband definition is 25 megabits down and 3 up. And it is not going to happen with a lot of these technologies. With fiber, you definitely should be able to get that kind of service. And with cable, you often can get that kind of service, but it's very difficult when it's DSL and it's satellite and it's dial-up, and those also make it very difficult to use more than one device at a time.
That's right. I think that's the key thing that people sometimes confuse about the definition of broadband. When the Federal Communications Commission set the definition of broadband, they took into account what typical households are doing on the internet. And a typical household has multiple devices. In fact, each occupant of a typical household has multiple devices that are using the internet concurrently. And they were looking at what kind of capacity would be necessary for that household so that everyone was able to use common applications without them degrading each other. And that's where the definition comes from.
So one other thing.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask one other thing, Chris. If you could take a moment and define for folks the difference between Wi-Fi and wireless.
Yes. Yeah, this is something that I thought would make sense for me to talk about wireless technologies next.
Okay.
Wireless is as you experience on a regular basis, the ability to move data without having a clunky wire connecting the devices that are communicating to each other. Wireless is a broad umbrella with many different technologies within it. Within those is the technology we most commonly use, which is Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi is a specific standard that many different companies manufacture devices for. It's in every laptop. It's in your phones. It's all over the place. And it uses a small section of spectrum. And basically, it's what people most commonly use, but it is limited. It's good for creating networks with links. It is not good for creating big networks across entire cities because any given antenna does not broadcast very far, and it uses a part of the spectrum that is prone to being interfered with, or it's not able to penetrate objects like walls and things like that very well. So Wi-Fi is, without a doubt, one of the best inventions of all time. It has led to incredible devices, incredible investment, all kinds of wonderful results, but sometimes people confuse that with wireless more generally. Other types of wireless include a number of technologies that we call fixed wireless. So fixed wireless is in juxtaposition to mobile wireless. Mobile wireless is what your cell phone is. No matter where you go, if you're within range of an antenna, it works. Fixed wireless typically requires a more bulky receiver antenna. And so if you have a home in a rural area, sometimes you may mount an antenna on the roof that is not going to move. Or if it does, something horribly has gone wrong. The goal of fixed wireless is that the antennas are fixed in place, and you can get very high quality connectivity across them. Mobile wireless is more challenging and transient, so those are some of the key issues there around that. Different types of spectrum we could talk more about if people are interested, but different types of spectrum have different capacity to work in mountainous regions or areas that have a lot of trees. Some technologies require there to be nothing between the two antennas. Some things like the spectrum that's used for cable television, for over-the-air television, is able to go through a lot of objects. So there's a lot of different characteristics there. And when we started Next Century Cities, I think we did not see, at that time there was not much high-quality fixed wireless connectivity on the market. Now there is more. So some of this stuff does change. But we continue to see that the highest quality connections are provided by wired connectivity, specifically fiber optic. So even though wireless is getting better, we still believe that most homes and certainly businesses are looking for a fixed wire connection to be able to provide high quality connectivity. Many of them will take that fixed connection and immediately turn on a Wi-Fi network to be able to distribute the connection within the building. But the Wi-Fi network is actually dependent on the fixed wire to deliver the service. And I think that's a pretty broad coverage of the wireless that covers some of the common questions I think we get. Is there anything else, Deb, that we should cover on wireless?
Yeah, I was just mentioning that.
We talked about that, Lena.
Yeah. But one of the things I wanted to mention about the fixed wireless, it could be one of the issues that people get confused about is very often people will say, well, that's a cheaper solution. We'll just do that in rural areas. And what they don't always understand is that it can't go necessarily over the mountain or through the trees. And so there are limits to it. And the other thing that's important to note is that you still need fiber, right? In this case, you wouldn't have fiber to the home, but you got to have fiber to the wireless point, right? That the sender of the signal has to have fiber. So there's still a need for a high capacity backhaul to bring that data back.
Right, and the single most important thing that people forget when they talk about wireless being cheaper is the term that's being discussed, the time, over what time period. Sometimes we think just about 2 to 4 years into the future. Fixed wireless does tend to be much cheaper over 2 to 4 years. But when you actually look over the lifetime of the next several decades, it becomes more expensive to do wireless because wireless needs to be replaced much more frequently. It has a higher operating cost. It requires more people to be able to fix problems than typical fiber optic networks do. So if you hear somebody say, oh, one technology is cheaper than the other, your next best question would be in what situations or over what time periods, because these things do fluctuate, and that's been left out of far too many conversations, I think. The other piece of wireless that is coming in a way, it's just another fixed wireless, satellite. And satellite is something that has typically had very high latency rates, which is a term that refers to the amount of time it takes from when I push start to do something, say like download a file. If I click to download a file, then for the second that I click it until the second that it actually starts downloading to my computer, you can think of that as the latency. Like how long does it take to start something? Satellite, it takes a long time to start something because you're basically sending a request out. It goes up, it hits a satellite like 25,000 miles away. It comes back down to Earth, and then there's something hits computers here. It goes back to the satellite, back to you. It takes a long time. It's made a modern web page, in fact, that has to happen multiple times. So it is a technology that has historically been somewhat challenged by that. It also has been expensive, and it has bandwidth caps and other challenges that people who use it tend to get very frustrated. There's a new generation of satellites coming that will be much better, we're told, And I suspect it will be, although these technologies always tend to be oversold. People have these expectations that ultimately end up, some of them are met, many others of them are not. So we're waiting to see what happens with those. They should have lower latency. They should have higher quality. We do not expect that it will obviate the need for more investment. And one of the challenges of all kinds of wireless, again, is that that links all kinds of wireless is that it may be leaving people behind in some communities, which is to say wireless, the way it works, if you live on the wrong side of a ridge, depending on the technology that's being used, there's no feasible wireless solution that will serve you. And so the question that policymakers should always be asking is, what happens to that between 1%, 5%, could be 10% of the population who cannot be served by a wireless business model? Is there anything that will be able to connect them? So those are common questions and things that have come up. Deb, if you're ready, we can move on to the next one. And
I'm ready.
And let me give another encouragement for people to just ask questions in the chat box or send Kat an email. Kat, have you got any questions?
Nope, none so far.
All right, you can ask questions about anything at any point. If it's related to broadband, we'll probably be better at answering it. But don't feel like you have to be constrained by the topic that we happen to be discussing right now. We can skip around a little bit based on what's important to people. Deb, do you want to take this first one so I can try and breathe again? Apologies.
Sure. An INET, or an institutional network, is something that is typically built by a community to support access in the city buildings, like the schools and the library, fire and police, maybe City Hall, and any other city-based offices. And the goal here is to get better service and often also to reduce the cost to the city of the monthly bill that they have been paying. So to both increase speed and lower the cost for the community itself for that access to those community assets. And so it would be built by the city and could be managed by the city, but it would definitely reduce costs. You want to take, I can talk about public-private partnerships too if you like, Chris.
No, I can jump in. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to cut you off. Somebody has a phone that's vibrating very close to a microphone, or it's coming through quite loudly. So if they can try not to be so popular, that'd be wonderful. In some ways, the public-private partnership type of network is an overlap with everything else, in that I think you could probably find ways of doing a partnership with any one of these models. The partnership basically suggests that the community is working with an independent partner. Frankly, that could be another city. It doesn't necessarily have to be a private company. It will often be a private company. In more rural areas, I suspect it may be a co-op in the near future, whether a telephone co-op or an electric co-op. And there's certainly examples of that. So it doesn't just have to be a company. In our experience, it tends to be smaller companies, or at least non-traditional incumbent companies. The incumbents seldom see a reason to engage in a partnership because they already have their infrastructure out there. But one of the key lessons for public-private partnerships is always how is risk shared and how are the benefits shared. In some ways, I think cities often are more concerned with the risk because one of the benefits that they're looking for is simply that everyone has higher quality access, or that some specific group has higher quality access. Many of us would like to see some of the benefits to the extent that there's profit, for instance. It'd be nice if that was shared, creating digital literacy programs or other sorts of public benefits, but cities will engage in different practices there. But the ultimate question is, when things get challenging, if the budget, if the cost of building network is more expensive, if there's lawsuits, who has to pay? Who makes decisions? Do you decide to start building out less and leave part of the town uncovered in the event that there's a challenge and something unexpected? Who makes that decision? Does the city have a say in it? If a partner decides to sell its share, does the city have any say over who buys it or other sorts of arrangements? These are some of the questions that get raised. There are not a lot of public-private partnerships out there today, but we see a lot of interest in them, and many of us think that there will be more of them in the near future as we learn lessons from the cities that are pioneering them. One of the best examples that we usually point people to is Westminster, Maryland, which has a public-private partnership with a company called Ting. Deb, is there anything else on public-private partnerships? If there is, we might be missing it because you're muted again.
No. If the one risk you mentioned that I think we should always pay attention to, the one difficulty is finding the partner. And it's often a regional, smaller entity, as you mentioned. So shall we go to incremental?
It can be difficult to find a partner. And some of the people, at least one of the persons that's on this webinar I know has experience with that. No matter how willing you are to partner with others, you have to find a partner, so that can be a challenge. I think incremental is one of the more overlooked approaches, and this is often coupled with an institutional network. In my mind, incremental just basically means you are not taking on a lot of risk to try to build very large all at once. An incremental could be a pilot project, or it could be something where when you build your institutional network and you're connecting the police station or city hall, you have some businesses nearby and you want to hook them up as well. You start building there, and maybe you see how that goes, and then you expand upon that further. You may have a goal of connecting everyone, but it's going to take 10 or 15 years. You're going to do it on an incremental basis. You're going to learn and iterate. That's basically what it comes down to. It's similar. You could use dark fiber as a technology. So in some ways, it's a model, but it's also more primarily a technology. This refers to the term dark fiber refers to fiber that's unlit. So if you're connecting your city buildings, you might do it, and you might only need, I'll just make up a number, 20 strands of fiber to connect your buildings to build the kind of network that you want. And in building your network between the buildings, you might lay 96 strands of fiber so that if some of those fibers break or have a problem, you have replacements. If you decide later to have change the way that you're using your network and you want extra fiber available, or you want to be able to lease them. One of the reasons that you would do that is because the cost of putting in 30 strands of fiber and the cost of putting in 96 or 144 strands of fiber is basically the same. And so you want to put in extra fiber if you can, because the cost of later going back and building more fiber will be so extreme that it will be cost prohibitive to do so. You put in lots of fiber and then you lease it out. Dark fiber is more like real estate than technology. You're leasing people a pipe, and then they have to figure out what they want to put through the pipe. They have to put their own pumps on each end to make it work. You're just giving them this effectively this strand, and they have to figure out what they're going to do with it. So that requires a high level of technical sophistication on the part of whoever's using it. Many cities will lease that to other ISPs or companies that have a specific business model of connecting businesses. Most businesses themselves are not going to want to get dark fiber, but there may be someone that you could work with that would use your dark fiber to connect others. Debbie, do you want to add anything, and then maybe just take a shot at open access?
Nope, nothing to add to that, but open access, so that's when the city builds out the system, it allows other people to lease it to provide service. And so the goal is to have, as Chris was talking about earlier, people who will send service over that pipe to the individuals you want to reach. And so a good example of that from our network is Ammon, Idaho, where folks can actually choose from multiple ISPs. And having multiple ISPs means they have a much lower cost. I can't remember exactly. Chris, do you remember what they're paying for high-speed access in Ammon?
I believe it's on the order of $20, $25 a month for 100 megabit or gigabit. It's incredibly low. There are a couple of additional costs in that particular approach. But they're still paying well under $100 if you aggregate all of those different costs together with the Ammon model.
Right, but it does lower the cost to those folks to partner with you because you've already put in the pipe, right? As you described with the incremental, if the pipe's already there and the fiber's already there, it is far less expensive to get a new entrant into your community, and that can really help to change the circumstance with providers, multiple providers, speeds, and costs.
Yes, one of the reasons that cities might do this is they might know of ISPs, internet service providers, that would be interested in offering services but don't have the capital to build out across the community. And so a city might build a network and then offer that to ISPs so that they can have access to many more customers than they could build, even though they might be very good at offering services, they may not have the interest or capacity to build a very large network themselves. But there's a number of different arrangements with this. Go ahead, Deb.
Right. I was just going to mention, and I think this is another circumstance where do you have a partner becomes the question, right?
Yes, it does. And one of the things that we hope is that as the cities that have been moving forward on this succeed and grow, that we will see more ISPs moving into this space. So there is a hope that as there are more networks available, entrepreneurs will create ISPs to compete on these networks. It is worth noting that if you build a network that has several hundred subscribers or potential subscribers, you probably attract one ISP. If you get into more than 500 to 1,000, you might be able to get a second ISP. You may need a few thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 before you get some real robust competition going. So that can be a challenge, but in any event, the open access network would be one of multiple networks available. So it's worth noting that this would probably not be the only network in town. You would still have a cable provider, likely a telephone provider offering DSL and or some fiber optics. And then you would have an open access network that might have anywhere from 1 to 20 or more ISPs operating on it, depending on your size.
I would say one of the other advantages, Chris, would be that if you as the city own that network, you have the capacity, even if it's in an incremental way, to ensure that there is no cherry picking, there is no I'm over the ridge so I didn't get access, right? Because the city has control of that.
Yes, and I think this is a more attractive model for cities that have not had a municipal electric power company. We'll talk about the model that most of the municipal electric power companies have used, or at least most of the cities that have used this model have had municipal electric power companies in a second. But cities that don't have a history of being in the electric business, you might be in the water business, you might be in the natural gas business, you might be in the solid waste business. Those things are a little bit different. And so you might be more comfortable doing an open access network because the city can focus on providing infrastructure, and you're not having to come up with a marketing plan to go head-to-head with Comcast or a big cable or telephone company in that case. That is the appeal in many ways, but it can be challenging because of what we talked about before with the challenge of finding ISPs. Cities may do an RFP to try and attract interest and get a sense of what's available. But then once you do have ISPs, you can still have problems. If an ISP is behaving poorly, it can be a challenging decision-making practice, whether you want to kick them off the network or how you would discipline them or otherwise constrain them. A final note is for cities that are concerned about net neutrality, privacy-type protections that are not being protected by the federal government anymore. You could write those sorts of protections into contracts for any ISP on an open access network that you own. So it does give you more tools, and as Deb said, you can make sure that lower income areas of town are built out and connected to these networks. And in many ways, I actually think that would create a market even for low income households, because once you don't, as an ISP, if you don't have to pay for the cost of the network, if you're just paying perhaps a slight percentage of your revenues or a fixed cost per customer connected, you may be able to connect low income families in a way that you could not if you had to build the network yourself.
Definitely more incentive.
So the citywide retail is, I think, most commonly associated with cities whose name rhymes with Chattanooga. It is a service in which the city would build a network, or citywide retail refers to one entity. In the case of this discussion, a city most likely, building a network to every premise, every resident, every business in a community, usually financing that with some sort of debt. Often that debt is repaid by revenues from the network, and the city would offer services. In many of the networks that were built more than 5 years ago, probably in all of the networks that were built more than 5 years ago, the city would offer the triple play of television, internet, and telephone service, and do customer service. I mean, it's basically, I think of it as perfecting the cable model of the triple play. And the more recent approach is some cities are finding ways of building these networks and offering only internet service, or sometimes internet and telephone. It is worth noting, I think you could get by if you're only going to do residential service with internet. A lot of residents are going to be less interested in the telephone. But if you want to connect businesses in your community, you will probably have to have a high-quality telephone product available for them, because few businesses are ready to go without a telephone, and they are typically want to bundle their telecom bill together. So this is a model that we typically think of as having the most risk because of the amount of money borrowed and the pressure on repaying the debt and then meeting the operating obligations and all of that. But it's also one in which the city can have the most control over the service that's delivered to the community. Is there anything else, Deb? Did you want to tackle the next one either way?
Sure. So, the advantages are huge to citywide retail, but you're right, it's also a risk. On the other hand, if you work with incumbents, there aren't a lot of risks involved. Somebody else comes in, builds the whole network, manages it, provides access, but you don't have the same benefits you do in terms of ensuring that there's no redlining, ensuring that costs are kept low, speeds are high, that they're providing the level of service the businesses want. However, there are many communities that are perfectly happy with the provider and service they currently have, and they feel like they have sufficient competition to keep the prices down. So that is always an option if your community is attractive to one of those big providers to come in. That sadly doesn't happen, as many of you know, in more rural parts of the country, and also in low income. We're finding more and more in low income areas there's a lot of redlining that has occurred that has kept those low income communities from getting high speed, low cost access.
Yes, I would note that one of the things to look out for in dealing with an incumbent provider is the let's have lunch in 2 months, or let's have coffee and talk about this, and then let's have coffee in another 2 months. Incumbents, may pretend to be interested in working with you just to delay, and so it is worth keeping that in mind as you are considering it. With any of these networks, in any partnership working with incumbents, it's worth thinking about leverage. What does the city bring to the game? If your city is simply saying, hey, we're a really nice place for you to invest, that may not be as attractive as we have fiber that we can get to you, or we have rooftops for your wireless, or we have some way of aggregating customers that will make it attractive to you, or some sort of arrangement, or we have this great deal with this other ISP that we're going to bring in, kind of the girlfriend or boyfriend from Canada at a summer camp argument of that people sometimes use to pretend that they're more popular than they really are. It's always worth having someone waiting in the wings to put pressure on your partner to make sure the partner doesn't feel like they can just walk away from the deal and leave you. You want to always have a sense with your partner that if they leave, it will be to their disadvantage. So.
So one last thing I'd mention on this page, Chris, is that in terms of the citywide retail and even open access and public-private partnership, there are some states that limit or create barriers to local communities building or investing in such networks. 19 or 20, depending on how you count it. And so that is an important thing to note as well.
Yes, and another good reminder that even in states that have barriers, few states limit everything. And so if you're in Florida, it will be difficult to build a citywide retail network, but there are other options that would be available to you from this list, such as incremental or dark fiber that would fit within law. Sometimes city attorneys might be more nervous about these, but I think it's important to note that there are generally examples that we could point to if people are concerned about what is permissible and would like a fact on the ground rather than just a legal theory for how to accomplish it. So always feel free to get in touch with Deb, me, or Kat with questions on these things.
Right, because there are always creative solutions, right?
Right. And let me just go on to the next one, Kat. But we are always, happy to answer any questions. If there are things people would like us to address, feel free to put them in the chat box or email Kat. But 5G, that looks to me like a poll on the right side there from Lincoln, Nebraska. But I'll ask our resident 5G expert, Deb, to maybe introduce this topic.
It is indeed. On the right is Lincoln, Nebraska, and on the left is from San Francisco, or right outside of San Francisco. But so I think the biggest trick is I often find that folks don't know what 5G is. So I'll just say there was 3G, which was third generation. There is 4G, which is fourth generation, and now there is potentially 5G. And I say that because right now there really aren't standards for this, and it probably isn't going to have standards and that are universally accepted for a couple more years. However, in the meantime, so the particular builds we're talking about are small cells. They use a part of the spectrum that doesn't go very far, so you need more of them, as opposed to the big mega towers we're used to that have helped to provide 3G and 4G cellular service. So this generation is supposed to provide better cell service, and it's also supposed to be used well for smart city applications. So things like smart cars and so forth. So we're waiting to see that. But in the meantime, one of the things this can do for your community is get you better 4G. So they are more densely placed. They are placed on city assets and also on telephone poles. Not all of our cities own their poles, but they are going to be densely placed, and they're really, honestly, only going to happen anytime in the near future in urban and well-populated areas. Again, this is a technology. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just in Palo Alto, and they were rolling out the wireless telephone companies are rolling out some there. And one of the things that is different is that whether it's 4G or 5G, we're going to see in some neighborhoods companies like Verizon using this wireless technology to compete with very high speeds to the home. As with previous wireless networks, your results will vary based on where your house is, what your house is constructed of, other issues with how many trees you have and things like that. So, you might have a neighbor that gets very good service from this, and you might get spotty service from this service. But Sacramento and 4 other cities are sort of test beds for this from Verizon, and we'll get a better sense of it. But the sense that we have from what they've told Wall Street is that this service will be very costly. It's not prohibitive for most families, but it will be more for an upper middle class family that's looking for higher speeds and willing to pay for them. It's going to be competing in that market. It's not so much going to be targeted at low-income folks in the way that I think T-Mobile and Sprint plans have in the mobile sector. And it remains to be seen whether anyone will be trying to target homes in using this technology in lower-income neighborhoods.
Right. And I would say the other thing to remember here is that this technology also requires fiber. So if you don't have fiber in your community yet, 5G isn't coming, right? So until there's fiber available. So the interesting thing is you do want this in your community if you can get it because it will provide way better service on your 4G network until 5G becomes a standard. And yes, they are deploying some tests in different communities, and we'll see how that all goes. I'm very interested to see. I think one of the things that I really do try to tell folks about is that the aesthetics are important, so some local decision making on this is important. You can see the difference between the pole on the left and the pole on the right, and that's about the difference between when the city has negotiating power and when the city doesn't. And so you definitely want to have something to say about that, and you want to have some kind of input. I will say the other thing is this is another circumstance where it's going to be important to collaborate with the providers. And one of the things that can help you be more attractive, as Chris spoke about earlier, you can make yourself more attractive to providers. And one of the ways in the case of 5G is to really think about your ordinances, your permitting process, and really work on those to make it more attractive to a provider to come in, because this is really different from the mega towers of the past. They're going to need a lot of permits, and they're going to need those permits to build multiple devices on poles within your urban core. I will say the other thing about this is that they will tell you that they are the size of a pizza box. That is the antenna, but that's not the only thing 5G requires, right? They have to have a switch box. They have to have an electrical box. They have all of these pieces that have to be included on the pole. So again, you want to make sure that you're talking about that part of it as well. And so on our site, we actually have a lot of resources about 5G. Kat will be showing some at the end, but I highly recommend you go take a look at some of the ordinances that are there and the permitting suggestions for cities as well. And also we have a couple of agreements from cities that have done a great job of negotiating the aesthetics and safety of these devices within their communities.
Yeah, one of the big hot topics in state legislatures has been the push from typically the big wireless companies to remove local authority, whether that is limiting the ability to recover costs, whether that's limiting the ability to charge a reasonable fee for access to the right-of-way, whether that is preventing city review of placement or height restrictions or other such things. This has been a big issue, and Deb has done a great job tracking it. We have written about it quite a bit. Deb generally knows what the status of each state has been, so if you have specific questions about your state, feel free to ask about it. We are very opposed to cities being preempted. We generally think that actually will make it more difficult to roll these out, because if cities are forbidden from, for instance, charging reasonable fees, they may not be able to hire the extra people that may be necessary to process permits. They may be, just angry, frankly, at the inability to deal with this. And when you have, public workers or elected officials who are hearing from angry citizens about something that's showing up in front of their lawn, possibly reducing their property values and such, on one hand, in a state preemption that they can't do anything about, on the other hand, it makes it a very poisoned working relationship. So one of the things that we feel like our role as the Next Century Cities is trying to help cities to detail the appropriate way of dealing with this. I don't think that your permitting processes from 10 or 15 years ago, in many cases, every city is different, but in many cases, it may not be the right permitting process for these companies to take out, tens or hundreds of permits in your community to be able to locate these wireless devices correctly. So, and then a final piece I want to note on this is that cities have been attacked for a long time by incumbents that have claimed that their policies, that city policies, are the things that are slowing growth. You hear from, if you listen to the FCC meetings, you get a sense that Comcast, AT&T, these other companies would have built, gigabit to the home networks to everyone, centuries ago, if not for restrictive city policies. And I think it's important to note that even if you craft good policies, you may not see a difference in investment in your community. So one of the things to do would be to review your policies, but do it perhaps in conjunction with a good faith entity. If you know there's a small ISP that wants to build in your community, try to get a sense of what it's like from their eyes when you're working through it. But don't think that just because you update your policies and create good policies that you will suddenly get a lot of new investment. That might be a false hope. I think maybe we can move on from 5G.
Hey, Chris, I'm going to jump in real quick. We have one question that's been submitted via email. Someone's hoping that one of you all could talk about mesh networks.
Yes, that would be good. So most of the networks that we've discussed and most of the networks that have been built by cities use a conceptual framework or a technology in which it's more hierarchical, which is to say that if I send a message to my neighbor, it doesn't go from my house to my neighbor's house. It goes from my house probably to the city's routers at the core of the city, or if it's over Comcast, it goes from my house to the center of Comcast network where they look at it, decide what to do with it, and then send it back to my neighbor's house. In a mesh network, you would have the ability to send something directly. Like my house would know how to send it right to my neighbor's house, or the devices on the street would say, "Oh, this doesn't have to go back to the central office. It's just going right over here to the neighbor's office." These networks are really popular, particularly among dissidents and others who are trying to evade surveillance. There's also lots of other reasons to build them, including the resiliency in the event of a disaster. However, there's not a lot of practical experience that I'm aware of with large-scale networks operating in this manner. And I continue to hope that there will be success with them. There's a number of networks that operate in this way wirelessly, often using a Wi-Fi technology that has been used, configured in a mesh approach. But it's something that I think still needs a little bit of work before I think we would see cities willing to put a lot of capital into it. I mean, if you're building a very challenging network, you often don't want to be the first one to do something. And so we haven't seen, again, to my knowledge, I'm not the biggest mesh expert in the world, but we haven't seen large-scale mesh networks, even on a citywide basis, except for volunteer, often driven mesh wireless approaches. Not to say it's not possible. There's many things that are desirable about it, but it has not a lot of working experience yet.
Thanks, Chris. I think you all are good to move on if you're ready.
Okay. So what's the next slide? And then I'm just wondering if there's people running out of time to get their questions in if they have questions. Do we have anything after financing, or is financing it?
That's it.
Well, someone sure structured this well. Luck of the draw. So cities, one of the reasons that my organization, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, originally looked at cities being so involved with broadband was because cities had the ability to finance things in ways that if all of us got together and formed a group to just build networks, nobody would lend us money, but cities could borrow stuff. So here are some of the ways that we see cities financing networks. One is bonds. We have seen a variety of bonds, from bonds that are issued without any backing and typically come with a higher interest rate. This would be a situation in which a city says, we have a good plan, we would like you to lend us money for this network, but if the revenues don't work, if we have problems, we will not guarantee that you'll be repaid. Those kinds of bonds have been somewhat rare, and I'm not aware of anything like that in the most recent years after one network in particular, or two networks, really struggled. And so bondholders, bond purchasers are typically looking for some kind of backstop now. and often were before. So that might be a general service obligation, a general, I can't remember what the term is now, but if the network did not make all of the revenues it needed, city would make payments from other sources, including sales tax or such things. So this is a common way of financing networks, but it is not the only way, and it's generally what first comes to mind. But it's worth noting that some cities that have built, for instance, institutional networks have done it in this way in which they would say, well, right now we're spending $1 million every year leasing lines from the telephone company to connect our facilities. It would cost us much less to build a network and operate it on a yearly basis than $1 million. So they may issue a bond over 10 years, and they would pay that bond back with the revenue that they otherwise would have sent to the telephone company for leasing. And so they get the money up front, you build the network, and then you continue to budget for telecommunications, but you're paying off the bond, presumably using, if you combine all of your payments, you would be paying less than $1 million a year, and so you would have extra money then that you could use to reinvest in telecommunications network or just put in public parks or whatever you wanted to do with. Is there anything else, Deb, that you think that's kind of the most straightforward one?
Nope, I think you got that very clearly covered.
So local improvement districts is what AMID is also using. There's several videos that explain this. One generally is one that Next Century Cities did about the AMID model, but there's also videos that AMID itself has produced talking about this. Local improvement districts will vary from state to state based on different authorities. Some states have recently created the authority to create a local improvement district. For instance, I believe Colorado just did last year. This is a situation in which a city may say, all right, we're going to define neighborhoods, and in this given neighborhood, there's 300 homes, and any of them that would like to take service from a municipal network will either have to pay, say, $2,000 up front, write a check for $2,000, or we will assess the home for the order of $10 to $20 per month over a course of 20 years. That would often, under current interest rates, work out to almost a $4,000 cost of total repayment, but nonetheless would be assessed on the home and therefore transferable to future owners. And then those people who opted in would be connected to the network. Different cities might handle it differently for those who opt out and then later change their mind. But there are ways of working that out. And this is an opportunity for those who are most excited about it to help finance it more directly and take a lot of the risk out. I don't know if there's anything else that I'm sort of leaving out there. It's pretty intuitive once you think about it, and it's in practice in several states in New England, Idaho, and Washington at least, and I think it's going to be spreading to others like Oregon and others. I'm sorry, Colorado. That's what I meant to say. Is there anything else, Deb?
No. Keep going, Chris. You're doing great.
Says Deb, who doesn't want to talk about tax increment financing, because no one wants to talk about tax increment financing. So this is a double-edged sword in a way that it seems really great until you load up your city with a lot of tax increment financing. So let me just say that this is an interesting way. If you haven't heard of it before, please don't get too excited. Learn about the drawbacks of it. This is the idea that if you have a property and you make an investment, that property will increase in value, and therefore it will pay more in taxes. And so you set aside the increase in taxes that are generated to pay back debt that you took out to make the improvement on the property. One of the challenges of this that I morally feel very strong, that I feel compelled to strongly state, is that if you have a lot of tax increment finance properties in your community, you are effectively taking money away from schools, police, and other essential functions, because as property taxes increase, that money is going back to a specific debt and not available for the increase in city services that might be required by those new investments. So nonetheless, there are communities who have felt that this is appropriate, and I frankly think that it is a very good tool to use. It's just a bad tool to overuse. And they would issue bonds or they would issue some form of debt in order to make the one-time investment and connecting those buildings with a fiber optic network often, and then it would be repaid by the increase in value of the building, increase in the taxes that were paid by that. Federal grants and loans are terrific when you can get them. They require a tremendous amount of paperwork often. They're often quite competitive. I generally think that it is a waste of time for most communities to be going after them. A lot of these programs serve historic constituencies. So if you want to get USDA funding, it's best if you're a co-op, an electric or telephone co-op that has previously done business with USDA. It's hard to figure out how to slot yourself in otherwise. There are exceptions to this, and one of them would probably be community development block grants, which we've seen a lot of in Virginia, used for broadband infrastructure. West Virginia has recently been using these as well, and it's something that I think many people don't realize you could use community development block grants for. So that is a federal source of funding that might be appropriate. But in general, I would say most of the communities that I've seen holding out hope for federal grants or loans are still holding out hope, whereas those who have turned to a more sustainable and local source of funding have been able to move forward, and perhaps not as strongly as they would like, but they've been able to do something. And then finally, infrastructure bill dollar, which is an ultimate big shrug because we don't really know what that's going to look like, if it will look like anything. This is a proposal from the Trump administration, which has to work its way through Congress still. There is certainly some suggestions from the Trump administration how they would like to see it happen. Many of us are dubious that Congress will shape it in that way. It remains to be seen whether or not anything actually happens. But there could be money available. It will probably be mostly structured for public-private partnerships. We'll certainly, if there's anything that develops in that way, we will certainly cover it and alert you to it so that you're able to be made aware of it. So with that, Deb, I think we can probably wrap up on time.
One quick mention I'll offer, if you are looking at a potential grant from the USDA or a loan from a federal agency, if you're looking at any of those types of efforts, you should contact us because we do have some contact folks within the federal government who would be willing to hop on a call with you. So let us know. And yes, Chris, I think with that, we are going to be able to hand it back to Kat.
Great. Let me just ask, I don't know if Kat was going to do this or not, but a lot of materials, we can send you anything if you want to contact us. This is the first time we've done this. It will be archived, but if you found that this was useful, let us know, because we thought it would be useful, and most of you that tuned in stayed, but would love to know your feedback on it. So go ahead, Kat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Definitely, I'll reiterate that. Please send us your feedback you have about this webinar. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the resources that you see on your screen now. So this is just a list of resources that are related to the topics that we covered today. Most of them come from either Next Century Cities website or the Community Broadband Network's website. I will be sending a follow-up email out after this webinar that will include links to all of these resources as well as a recording of this webinar. And I just want to encourage all of you to, again, reach out to Deb, Chris, or myself with any questions, but also to just spend a little time poking around the Next Century Cities website, nextcenturycities.org, or the Community Broadband Network's website, muninetworks.org, if you have any further questions or looking for more information. So with that, I will say thank you so much to Deb and Chris for sharing your wisdom with us, as always. And thank you to everyone who joined today, and be on the lookout for that follow-up email from me. Thanks very much, everyone.